think there are several parts of this passage of Scripture that are worth just kind of taking out and kind of looking at for a little bit. And I think that this Scripture passage speaks to us today, perhaps in a very powerful way. I think one of the things that's important to see, and one of the things that I notice in this Scripture, is that we find a woman who is longing and crying out to be heard. She wants to be heard. She wants someone, Jesus specifically, to hear her cry, to hear her pain, and to do something about it. And I imagine that maybe she has cried out to her own people for quite some time, and there was nothing that they could do, and perhaps they grew tired of hearing from her. She cried out for the disciples, and we do know the disciples were tired of hearing from her. But here's a woman whose daughter is tormented by a demon. And so she's tormented. You know, I can't imagine as a parent what it's like to experience and watch your child suffer, whether it's demonic or demons, or whether it's depression or mental illness or severe disability or illness or any of these things. It must have been torture and torment for her mother to watch her child suffer in this way, and she's desperate for someone to hear it, to hear her cry and to understand, and to do something about it. I think it's important to see here we find a woman who is longing to be heard. I think another piece of this that's important for us to see and really dig into to understand is the setting, the physical setting, and the identity of this woman. So Jesus had withdrawn, he withdrew from that place, left that place, and went to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Now, those are a district, have become a district. They used to be two cities that kind of grew together, and they're kind of always referred to, especially now in the first century, that first century time, as one place. Tyre and Sidon, they went together. But they are outside of the land of Israel. This is Canaanite, it is Canaanite land, but it's Gentile land. They were never a part of the kingdom of Israel, and so Jesus is stepping out of kind of his land. He's stepping out from his people and going to a new district, a different place. We can speculate why, only speculate why he wants to go there. It could be that, kind of like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, maybe he just needed to get away for a little bit. Hey, they are at the beach beside the ocean. That'd be a nice place to get away. Two, maybe he just needed to get away and take some time. He had just had an argument with the Pharisees and scribes, and maybe he's pulling out of that. But this is Canaanite land or Gentile land, and it's not his people. And that's important to note. That's important to understand. And then we have this woman. And she is identified in Matthew's Gospel as a Canaanite woman, which is an interesting term. It's an interesting way for Matthew to identify her, because by the first century, there really weren't Canaanite people anymore. That was a people group that kind of no longer existed anymore. Kind of like today, if we were to talk about the Aztecs or Mayans. Those people are there. They have been intermarried, and that area has been taken over by country and country and country, and the Canaanites don't really exist as a people group anymore in the first century. And so when Matthew calls her a Canaanite woman, he wants us to pay attention. He wants us to understand something. And what do we know about the Canaanites? Well, the Canaanites are one of Israel's oldest enemies. Right? In fact, the tension between the people of God and the Canaanites goes back maybe even to part of the time with Noah. And there were some difficulties with Abraham. In fact, remember, Rebekah doesn't want Jacob to have a Canaanite wife. And Esau, being a good son, when he finds out his parents don't want him to have a Canaanite wife, goes and marries Canaanite women to get back at him. And so there's tension there. In the time of Moses, of course, Moses is leading the people and they're fighting the Canaanites. And then with Joshua, as the people enter into the promised land, into the land of Canaan, they're the Canaanites that they are fighting. And as troubling as this passage is, we see in Joshua and we see in other scripture passages that God is very clear that you are to wipe them all out. Kill them all of the Canaanites. And sometimes even their livestock. Women, children, all of them. And the Israelites never completely followed through with that. And so there are Canaanites, and there's always this tension. So when Matthew says she's a Canaanite woman, he's telling us that she represents his oldest enemy. The people's oldest enemy. I think something else that is important for us to look at when we look at the scripture is to pay attention to not just the setting of where it takes place, but also the setting within the Gospel of Matthew. What is taking place in the Gospel of Matthew? What has happened right before this? And what's happened is that Jesus has gotten into an argument. He's gotten into an argument with the scribes and the Pharisees. They have come to him and they say, "Why do your disciples not follow the traditions of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." And then Jesus kind of says, well, there are a lot of ways that you don't follow the law. And then Jesus pulls the crowd together and he talks about what defiles, what truly defiles. He says, what is it that really makes something unclean? And he says, it's not what enters into your body, it's not what comes in, but it's what comes out, what comes from your heart. And from the heart comes evil intentions. From the heart comes hatred and all of these things. Good things too, but he says this is what comes out of your heart and what you say and how you act. That is what defiles, not what comes in. And then Jesus ends up hearing this woman, who is a Canaanite, calling out for his help. It's what comes out of your heart is what makes something clean or not clean. And very quickly, a story about a Gentile who is his oldest enemy. Yet, she cries out with incredible faith. Is she clean? Is she unclean? Then we have to look at some of the words that Jesus says. When this woman has been crying out, the disciples say, "Lord, please just send her away. We're tired of hearing her." And Jesus answers. He doesn't send her away, but he answers. He says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then when she bows before him and she pleads for his help, he says, it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Does this sound like Jesus? Not particularly. It's Matthew's gospel, by the way, that tell us that when Jesus was born, the Magi had come. The Magi, who are leaders from far distant countries. Is the Messiah just for the house of Israel? It's Matthew's gospel where we see Jesus, in other places too, but that he heals the centurion's servant. This is a Roman soldier, and he does that. Why is it now that he's in a foreign district, he's out of his own country, why is he saying this, that I've only come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel? Why does he say, is it right for me to take the children's food and give it to the dogs? Is he calling this woman a dog? I think it's a fair question. What's going on here? So we have a woman who is desperate. She's desperate to be heard. She's a woman who is called a name that represents the oldest enemy of Israelite. We have Jesus who has just talked about what's clean and not clean. We have some surprising words from Jesus. And then we have the ending, where Jesus heals the dog. What's going on? You know, when we look at the words that Jesus says, some say that maybe he's just testing her. Maybe he's testing to see how faithful she'll be. She'll continue on. And I suppose that's a possibility. Perhaps he was. Perhaps that's part of it. I looked at those words that Jesus said, and I said, I don't think that sounds like Jesus. I wonder what's going on here. And I wondered if maybe he wasn't testing his disciples, and maybe even us. Was he testing us, those of us that would read this passage later on? Is he testing his disciples to say, does this sound like me? Or does this sound more like the Pharisees? That have just caused a conflict with me? But I wonder if it's possible, if in this moment, Jesus wasn't working it all out for himself. I think maybe, I have to say, I think Jesus already knew that his ministry and mission was more than Israel. I think he knew that. But I think there is a possibility in this moment that he was working through some of that. And maybe what he's doing is he is offering the arguments that other peoples have made. And don't they make sense? Doesn't he make some valid points? I've only been sent to the lost sheep of Israel. It's not fair to take the food that's for the children and give it to the dogs. Those sound like valid arguments, but I think perhaps what's happening is Jesus is working through this himself. He's thinking about these arguments himself, and are they valid? Are they good? And is this right? And I think the woman pushes him over and gets him there when she says, yes, Lord, it's not fair. It's not fair to take children's food and give it to the dogs, but even the dogs eat the crumbs from the master's table. And she says, your bread, Lord, your bread is powerful enough. It's big enough. It's large enough, not just to heal the children of Israel, but to heal the entire world. I don't even need a seat at your table, Lord. I just need a crumb of your bread, because a crumb of your bread is enough to drive out the evil and the torment and the pain that afflicts me. Your bread is enough. And here, I think
Jesus gets it. He completely gets it. And he says, yes, that's right. The bread of God is more powerful than we've ever imagined. And yes, your faith has shown it to me. Yes, your faith is strong. What you ask for is yours.
And then Jesus goes about sharing his bread with the world. A couple of verses later, we find in Matthew's Gospel the feeding of the 4,000. Did you know there was a feeding of 4,000? 5,000 and the feeding of 4,000. Two different occasions. And when Jesus feeds the 4,000, they collect 7 basketfuls of leftovers. When he fed the 5,000, there were 12 basketfuls. What do the 12 baskets represent? The disciples, which kind of represent what? The 12 tribes of Israel. What do you think the 7 baskets represent? The 7 nations that the Israelites fought with in the land of the promise, the promised land. A Canaanite woman receives a miracle. And now the bread of God is for the world. Even those old enemies, they're going to be a part of the kingdom. The bread is for them as well. And get this. In that one word, in that one moment, Jesus puts an end to an old war. That old holy war, fighting with the Canaanites. He finally puts an end to it by healing the Canaanite woman. And by the way, he doesn't call her Canaanite, he says woman. Because they're equal. Well, not equal to Jesus, but equal to King. He puts an end to an old war. Puts an end to it. There's been a lot of talk in our country lately about an old war, hasn't it? And it's difficult. And it's painful. We've watched violence erupt because of that old war. And opinions are all over the place on what we should do. What should we do with these monuments? And it's complicated. It's complicated for me because I am a son of the South. And I had grandfathers on both sides, my mom's side and my father's side, who fought on the wrong side for the Confederacy. Yes, I'm going to say it, the wrong side. And I remember in the fall, I went up to Gettysburg, went up to the battlefield, and I drove around. And I stopped at the memorial for North Carolina, where my grandfather, however many greats. And there was something that I kind of appreciated that being there. He was part of Pickett's charge, which was a terrible, terrible blunder of a mistake. I think Lee even admits that that was a mistake. And it was an awful thing. It was an awful war. Very painful war. But there's something in me that I don't know if it's pride, but at least being thankful that that monument was there. And I think that maybe battlefields are appropriate places for monuments. just going to share my opinion with you. You can take it as my opinion. I think that some of these other monuments are not there to preserve history, and I think it's time for some of them to come down. I think in my hometown of Raleigh, there are monuments on the Capitol that were put there not to preserve history, but were put there to remind a certain part of the population that, hey, if we would have won the war, things would be different for you. And we want you to know who we really are, what we really think. And I think it's time for some of those to come down. I think that it is difficult because I don't think all the monuments were put in that way, but I do think that some of them were. And I wonder if the church doesn't have a word to say here that can help us put it in to old wars. Look, monuments literally put figures up on pedestals. But a lot of times when the monument is a figure, it's not just to talk about the person, to glorify and lift up the person, but to lift up what they stood for. And what did the Confederate generals stand for? They stand for a hope of a country that wanted to continue to oppress people. And to me, I think those ought to come down. I think that in battlefields, I think that preserves history. I think even some of the ones in the Confederate soldiers in the National Cemetery, I think that was done out of grace, and I think those are good. And I understand that maybe my thinking is not perfect. And here's the thing. I know that some of you have a different opinion than I do. And that's okay. We can have a different opinion. Some of you may think that we ought to take them all down, even the ones at the battlefield. And that's fine. But here's an old war that our country can't seem to get over. And I wonder if the church has a word to speak to. And all I want to ask of you is that when you think about these monuments, is that you think about this story here. And I want you to consider what Jesus did, which spoke against his people, and the attitude of Jesus and what that might mean for what our country ought to be. And if you can consider this story and you come out on a different side of me, then I'll respect that. But we should have, as Christians, respectable understanding of other people. And I just wonder if the church can't speak a word to set people who have been crying out, longing to be heard, to set them free. Grace and peace.